This is the first lecture by Dr. James Onley since he was appointed as Ahmed Seddiqi Chair in Gulf and Middle Eastern Studies since August 2022. So this is really heavily anticipated event. We're very excited to have him here. On behalf of the Department of International Studies and then, if I may, the university, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Seddiqi family for their tremendous support in advancement of research and the creation of new knowledge in the areas of Gulf and Middle Eastern studies. The Seddiqi family established the endowed chair with a very generous endowment of 15 million dirhams to honor the name of the late father, Mr. Ahmed Seddiqi, and who was very keen on education in general, and who believed that education is a vital pillar to the personal advancement and his children's role at home as parents. So today's lecture will be the first of many to come to generate greater public interest in Gulf and Middle Eastern studies here in the region, hopefully, beyond AUS. So please stay tuned. Now, let me just introduce to you the speaker. Dr. James Onley received his Doctor of Philosophy in History from the University of Oxford in 2001. He is a preeminent scholar in the history and heritage of Gulf region and the Gulf's historical connection with South Asia, archives, archival digitalization, and digital humanities. His monograph, The Arabian Frontier of the British Rajah, Merchants, Rulers, and the British in the 19th Century Gulf, published by Oxford University Press in 2007, was runner-up for Mensa's Book of the Year award. His recent book, Qatar, India and the Gulf, History, Culture and Society, published by Qatar National Library Press in 2019, was accompanied by a major exhibition by the same name, sponsored by the government of Qatar and India. While maintaining an impressive level of scholarly productivity, Dr. Onley has generously lent his time and expertise to nurturing young scholars and shepherding the future growth in Gulf studies. Dr. Onley was director of the Center for Gulf Studies at the University of Exeter, where he managed its renowned master's and PhD programs, convened its annual Gulf conference, and coordinated its many research activities. He is a founding editor of the Journal of Arabian Studies, the leading international journal in Gulf and Arabian Peninsula studies, editing 23 issues since 2011. He has successfully bid for and managed $30 million in research funding for multiple archival digitalization projects since 2010. Before joining AUS, Dr. James was the founding director of historical research and partnership at Qatar National Library, responsible for identifying historical collections on the Gulf region in archives around the world, and then negotiating and managing the subsequent archival digitalization projects to digitalize these collections for Qatar Digital Library, the world's largest digital archive on the Middle East. In recognition of his expertise, Dr. Onley has become a sought-after advisor to governments on Gulf history and heritage, including the Zayed National Museum, the National Museum of Qatar, the Omani Ministry of Heritage and Culture, the British Museum, the British Library, the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and then the US Department of State. He has also served on the boards of the Association for Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Studies and the International Association for the Study of Arabia. Very impressive. Some of you may know or may not know Dr. James Onley has a long-standing connection with AUS. He spent the early years of his academic career here at AUS as an assistant professor in our department during 2003 and 2005. So his return to AUS is, in fact, a homecoming. And it's great to have you here today with us. And this is where everything started. So, Dr. James Onley, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Yu Ting, for that wonderful, very generous, gracious introduction. And thank you all for coming today. I hope I will not disappoint. It's a great honor to be the first holder of the Ahmed Seddiqi Chair in Gulf and Middle Eastern Studies. The university and I are deeply grateful to the Seddiqi family for endowing this important position. My paper today examines the Gulf's deep historical connections with India and the impact that has had on Gulf material culture. So I'll give you a few examples of that towards the end of my paper. My talk's going to cover 7 different points here: an overview of the subject matter, then the Persian origins of the name India as an example of the deep cultural impact both regions have had on each other, then sailing between the Gulf and India, maritime trade, an overview, ancient trade links, the India trade, and then finally Gulf imports from India before oil and their incorporation into Gulf material culture. So, overview. India and the Gulf have been interconnected for time immemorial, despite being geographically separate. Before the oil era, Gulf Arabs have always looked towards the Indian Ocean for their supplies and sources of prosperity. Their maritime orientation towards India, above all, has profoundly influenced their history and culture. The Gulf has long been enmeshed in the movements of goods, peoples, and cultures between East and West, from the ancient maritime trade routes between the Indus Valley, Dilmun in Bahrain, and Mesopotamia in Iraq in the 20th century BC, to the global air and sea networks linking the Gulf and the wider world today. Throughout this time, India has always loomed large over the horizon, attracting most of the Gulf's exports and supplying much of what made life possible in the days before oil. This Times article from 1945 aptly describes the importance of India for the Gulf. Quote, "The Persian Gulf has closer ties with India than with Iraq, Egypt, or the Levant. Most of its trade is with India. Food supplies come from India, and Bombay is the market for pearls before they are sent to Europe. The number of Arabs who traveled from the Gulf to Egypt is small in comparison with the number who pay regular and lengthy visits to India. The political future of India is of much more interest here than the situation in Palestine." Today, the Indian connection is more apparent than ever, with the presence of over 8 million Indian expatriates living and working in the GCC states, giving the neighborhoods in which they predominate the feel of Indian towns. This talk provides an overview of the fascinating yet sometimes forgotten connections between India and the Gulf, stretching across the Indian Ocean, from shared cultures to shared histories and empires. It serves as a reminder of how important they are to each other and why the recent strengthening of ties is less of a new strategy than a renewal of an ancient relationship. Part 2. The historical and cultural connections between the Gulf and the Indian subcontinent date back at least 4,600 years, during which time the two regions have influenced each other in profound ways. The very name India, for instance, is a legacy of these historical connections, as Andrew Wink, in his famous book on India, has commented. Quote, "In a political geographical sense, India, or Al-Hind, throughout the medieval period, was an Arab or Muslim concept. The Arabs, like the Greeks, adopted the pre-existing Persian term, but they were the first to extend this application to the entire Indianized region, from Sind and Makran to the Indonesian archipelago and mainland Southeast Asia. It therefore appears to us as if the Indians or Hindus acquired a collective identity in interaction with Islam. The etymology of India thus helps us understand the emergence of the idea of India itself. India derives through ancient Greek Indus and Latin India from Hindus, the old Persian name for the Sindhu, the Sanskrit name for the Indus River, which flowed through the heartland of the Indus Valley civilization. Hindus later became a province of Persia's Achaemenid Empire from 518 to 323 BC, an early Parthian empire during the 120s to the BC to the 50s AD. Around the 1st century AD, the Parthians added the suffix stan, or land, to create Hindustan, the land of the Hindus. which was the Middle Persian name for the province during the later Parthian Empire from the 50s to the 210s AD, as well as Persia's Sassanid Empire from 284 to 410 AD. From this name, a person from the province came to be called a Hindu or Hindustani, plural Hunud, which in modern Persian means a Hindu or Indian more generally. These were also the terms used by Persian speakers in the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire for their domains and subjects throughout South Asia. The Arabs, however, preferred Arabized versions of the old Persian names, al-Hind for India and al-Hindi for an Indian, plural Hunud. By the time of the Arab conquest of Sind in 711, al-Hind had expanded in meaning to encompass the whole Indian subcontinent, of which Sind or As-Sind formed a part. Indians naturally had their own names for India, such as Bharat, the holy Sanskrit name for India and the official Hindi name for the country since 1950. But the Arab and Persian names of Hind and Hindustan were equally common before independence, along with their modern-day derivative, India. After Indian independence, Hindustan fell into disuse and India was adopted as the official English name for the country in its 1949 constitution. Part 3. Ships have been sailing across the Indian Ocean between the Indian subcontinent and the Gulf since the invention of ocean-going seagoing vessels in the 3rd millennium BC. The earliest account of Indian ships in the Gulf is this cuneiform tablet here, recording the words of the Akkadian king Sargon, who ruled from 2334 to 2279 BC, in which he mentions the ships of Mahala, the Akkadian name for the Indus Valley civilization, anchored at the city of Akkad in central Mesopotamia. Archaeological evidence suggests that trade contacts were established as early as 2600 BC. Before steamships linked India and the Gulf in the 1860s, sailing was governed by the Indian Ocean's rainy southwest monsoon season and the dry northeast monsoon season. These were the two sailing seasons in the Gulf for dhows heading to India. The start of the southwest monsoon season during mid-March to mid-May, and the end of the southwest monsoon season during mid-August to late September was when you would head out from, say, for example, the Emirates or Kuwait to India. Between these two periods, during the height of the southwest monsoon, from late May to mid-August, India's ports were closed to shipping due to the heavy rains and strong winds in India. So if you've ever been to India during the monsoon, you know it's very, very wet and windy. The entire northeast monsoon from early October to mid-March was good for westbound dhows sailing from India back to the Gulf. Dhows followed one of two routes across the Indian Ocean to and from India. The safer coastal route, staying within sight of the Arabian Sea's northern shore, and the riskier direct route, sailing directly across the Arabian Sea. With a favorable wind, a dhow sailing from Kuwait to Bombay could take 3 to 4 weeks, while a journey from Muscat to Bombay could take about 2 weeks. Sailing times also varied by ship size and type. Without a favorable wind, sailing times could easily double. The sailing season of mid-August to mid-May conveniently dovetailed with the pearling and date harvest seasons here in the Emirates and the other Gulf states of May to mid-September, when India's ports were closed to shipping. The sailing, pearling, and date harvest seasons were economically interconnected in several ways. First, pearls and dates were Eastern Arabia's main exports to India, and the bulk of the region's imports from India were purchased from the resulting profits. Second, at the end of the pearling season, pearling dhow crewmen with the necessary skills joined the crews of cargo dhows engaged in the India trade. And third, at the start of the pearling season, some cargo dhows returning from India were redeployed as pearling vessels. The Gulf's ancient maritime connections with the Indian subcontinent are symbolized by the stories of Sinbad the Sailor, associated with the 1001 Nights, a collection of Middle Eastern folktales dating from the Abbasid Empire. Sinbad is is a fictional Arab merchant from Baghdad who sailed from Basra to India and the wider Indian Ocean during the reign of Caliph Harun al-Rashid of Baghdad from 786 to 809 AD. In his first voyage, Sinbad describes a visit to India as follows. One day, I went to see King Maharajan, which I guess is Maharaja, and found him with a group of Indians. I saluted them, and they returned my salutation, welcomed me, and asked me about my country. I then asked them about theirs, and they told me that they consisted of various races. One is called Kshatriyas, who are the noblest of the races and who oppress no one, nor inflict violence on anyone. Another is called the Brahmins, who abstain from wine but live in joy, sport, merriment, and prosperity, possessing horses, camels, and cattle. They told me, moreover, that Indians consist of 72 castes, and I marveled at that. In Persian, Sinbad means the wind of Sind. Sind is the region of the Indian subcontinent closest to the Gulf, as well as the Indian name for the Arabian Sea before the Arab conquest of Sind in the 8th century, the Sindhu Sagar, as you can see from this map. Sinbad, therefore, may have been the nickname referring to the winds that carried Gulf dhows to and from India for millennium. The Sinbad stories likely originated from medieval sailors' travel accounts, like those connected by Barzug bin Shahryar Ramhurmuzi, a famous 10th century ship's captain, or Nakhora, in his book Wonders of India, as you see here. In 1981-82, the British explorer Tin Severin famously reenacted these accounts by sailing a replica of a medieval dhow from Oman to India and then China, a journey of 9,600 kilometers lasting 8 months, which he immortalized in his book, The Sinbad Voyage. In 1862, the British India Steam Navigation Company introduced a regular Bombay Gulf service, shortening the sailing time between Bombay and Basra by several weeks, from several weeks to several days, and strengthening the links between India and the Gulf region. But dhow journeys have continued to the present day, powered by wind until the mid-20th century, and thereafter powered by motors. And you can see them if you just go down to the docklands in Sharjah or Dubai. Part 4. Until the 1950s, and the dawn of the oil era, the Gulf's maritime merchants regarded Indian ports as closer in terms of travel time and more important economically than any Middle Eastern city. For them, it was Bombay they knew, not Beirut, Calicut, not Cairo, and Surat, not Suez. Before the advent of modern air travel in the mid-20th century, therefore, the port towns of the Gulf belonged more to the Indian Ocean world than to the Middle East. Consider, for instance, this sample survey of Middle Eastern trade with India. The intensity of Eastern Arabia's trade with India, shown here, was the case for millennia until the 1950s. After the advent of oil and the resulting economic reorientation of Eastern Arabia towards the Arab world in the West in the 1950s and 60s, India was gradually surpassed as the Gulf's main trading partner. Since the late 2000s, however, the GCC's trade with India has returned to its historic levels of intensity. But the tables have now turned. Now the GCC states are India's largest regional bloc trading partner, surpassing the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and the European Union. Part 5. As previously mentioned, the Indian subcontinent's maritime trade links with the Gulf region extend back to the mid-3rd millennium BC. Archaeological digs in the modern-day GCC states, Iraq, and Iran have uncovered a wide range of artifacts from the Indus Valley civilization from 2600 to 1900 BC that show close commercial connections with Sindh, the Punjab, Baluchistan, Kutch, and Gujarat. There is also clear evidence of Indus Valley influence on Gulf material culture. For instance, merchants in Dilmun, which is ancient Bahrain from the 3rd to the 1st millennium BC, used the Indus Valley weight system with its unique units of measurements instead of the Mesopotamian weight system, indicating the extent of Dilmun's trade with India. Before the Arab conquest of Sindh in 711, commercial ties between the Gulf and India were close, but during the Abbasid Empire, the two regions became an integrated trading zone from 750 to 871 AD. This was reflected in the common Arabic term for the coastlines between Sind and the head of the Gulf during the Sassanid and Abbasid eras, the Ard al-Hind, or Land of India. During the same time, India's trade links with Al-Udula, then Iraq's oldest port, were so strong that it was known as the Farj al-Hind, or the frontier of India. And similarly, in Bushehr, in southern Iran, was known as the Darvazia Hind, or gateway of India. These names were a reflection of the Gulf's strong trade ties with India and the sizable Indian communities of merchants and tradesmen residing in these ports. Part 6. Because of the shortage of almost everything in Eastern Arabia, almost everything had to be imported. The largest source of imports and market for exports was always India. The main ports and towns in India that merchants in the Gulf traded with varied over the centuries, as the table here shows. Most of the goods imported by Gulf ports, that is wood, metal, cloth, rice, coffee, tea, sugar, ghee, and spices, were shipped from the ports listed in this table. The Gulf's new profitable export, the Gulf's few profitable exports were horses, pearls, and dates. Pearls were the backbone of the economy for Kuwait and Bahrain, Qatar, and the Trucial States, now the UAE, until the 1930s. They were bought by Indian, Arab, and Persian pearl merchants and taken to Bombay, as you see here, the capital of the Indian Ocean pearl market in the 18th to 20th centuries. Part 7, last part. The strong commercial connections between India and the Gulf over millennia naturally led to a strong Indian influence, clearly evident in Gulf material culture, from its architecture and accoutrements to clothing and cuisine. Gulf dhows were built with teak imported from India. The houses of Gulf elites were decorated with doors, with Indian doors and furniture. Kashmiri shawls adorned the heads of many Gulf Arabs in winter, and still do. Colorful Indian turbans were worn by the ruling families of Sharjah, Ras Al Khaimah, and Oman, and some other Gulf Arab merchant families. Gulf Arabs ate their lamb and fish with curry and rice from India every day. In these and countless other ways, the Gulf's ports and peoples were deeply connected with the world of India, while an Indian world, in the form of communities, existed among them. Now I'd like to talk about some of the aspects of aspects of India that have been incorporated into Gulf material culture. So we'll begin with wood. One of Eastern Arabia's greatest restrictions was the lack of wood for building material, especially dhows, since most of what makes life possible in Arabia had to be imported from overseas. The best building material for dhows was Indian teak from the Malabar coast, the coast of the state of Kerala in western India. This is why Gulf Arab carpenters imported their wood and even their carpentry tools from India, while the largest dhows, requiring plank sizes and amounts that were sometimes impractical to import, were built on commission by Keralite carpenters and dockyards on the Malabar coast. The presence of Kerala-built dhows in the Gulf, therefore, is quite ancient. The annual Dhow Festival in Dubai every November is the largest assembly of Gulf dhows in the world. All of these dhows were built with Indian wood, and some were built by Indian carpenters in India. These dhows not only connected the Gulf with India, their very origins was Indian. This connection was celebrated in 2015 by the voyage of the Qatari dhow Fatah al-Khair II, which sailed from Doha to Mumbai and back for the annual Dhow Festival that November. Indian doors. One of the greatest symbols of wealth in the pre-oil Gulf were the large decorative teak doors that adorned the homes of the ruling families and prominent merchant families in every Gulf port. The doors were usually imported pre-carved from Gujarat, a region famous for its carving industry and an ancient trading partner with the Gulf. The simpler, undecorated doors of humbler homes were made by local carpenters from cheaper wood, although still imported from India. A common furniture item found in most Gulf homes was the Arab chest, such as the one appearing here, used to store clothes. The name is misleading, however, for the adjective applied to the owner, not the maker. Arab chests originated as an Indian copy of a Portuguese seaman chest from the days of the Estado de India, Portugal's Indian Empire, encompassing Western India, the Lower Gulf, including the Emirates, and East Africa in the 16th to 18th centuries. Most chests were made of Indian teak or rosewood. Many were made by craftsmen from Kutch, Gujarat, Bombay, and Kerala, as you see here, although some were made by Kuwaiti, Omani, and Iranian carpenters using Indian materials. Indian headdress. One of the most obvious examples of Indian influence on Gulf material culture is the Kashmiri shawl, worn by the Gulf Arabs and Yemenis during the winter months since at least the 18th century. In Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Qatar, it is worn as a headscarf, a shmag or gutra, with a head rope, a gal, to hold it in place. In the Emirates, Oman, and Yemen, it is worn as a turban, known as the amama here, and the musar in Oman, as shown here. Standard Kashmiri shawls were made from cashmere wool from Kashmir goats, while the finest and most expensive Kashmiri shawls were made from pashmina wool from pashmina goats. Kashmir and pashmina wool is much warmer, stronger, finer, and lighter than sheep wool. White shawls with a band of embroidery inset from the edge, like this one here, were worn throughout eastern and southern Arabia, while the colored shawls with extensive embroidery are also popular in southern Arabia, that is Oman and Yemen. Another headdress, likely of Indian origin, used by the Gulf Arabs, was a multicolored cotton turban worn by two Gulf Arab ruling families, the Abu Sa'id of Oman and the Qawasim of Sharjah and Ras Al Khaimah, as well as the Hawala, a transnational Arab merchant community found throughout the Gulf and the wider Indian Ocean. Today, only the Abu Sa'id continue to wear such a turban, which the Omanis call the Sa'idi. It has a specific shape and unique look that is unique to the Abu Sa'id. The Indian-style turbans worn by the others until the 1940s varied somewhat in color, pattern, and shape. Here are some examples from the Farouk al-Arshi family, a Gulf Arab merchant family who were members of the Hawala. Another common Indian item found in most Gulf homes was the peacock mirror, made in Bombay for the Gulf market during the late 19th to mid-20th centuries. The mirrors varied considerably in design, but usually featured two symmetrical Indian peacocks, or peafowls, facing each other. Peacocks are indigenous to India, but exotic to the Gulf, where they symbolize beauty, fertility, and wealth. Peacock mirrors were purchased by Gulf Arab families during their seasonal visits to Bombay as gifts for newlywed couples, the peacocks possibly symbolizing the bride's attributes. If anyone knows the answer, I'd be grateful if you'd let me know. You probably know. Peacocks also symbolize the Gulf's perception of India as a land of color, beauty, and sophistication. This concludes my talk, but there are many more subjects I did not have time to touch on, such as the Gulf Arab merchant communities in India, the Indian merchant communities in the Gulf, and how Arabia formed part of the British Indian Empire, the subject that I wrote my first book on, and how the Indian rupee was the main unit of currency in the Gulf until the 1960s. I mean, and indeed it's still, you might not be aware of this, but the rupee still lives on in the currency conversion rates between all of the GCC currencies and the US dollar. The reason why they're set at that fixed rate for example, 1.675 dirhams to $1 US is that was what the exchange rate was for the rupee for the dollar. The one it took 3.675 rupees to buy $1 US at the time when the UAE adopted the dirham. So the rupee still lives on in the currencies of the Gulf today. So while I have barely touched the surface of what is a vast subject, perhaps I can address some additional aspects of the Gulf's deep historical ties with the Indian subcontinent in the questions. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Well, the floor is open. I hope you enjoyed the talk. It was a bit of a whirlwind tour and just the tip of the iceberg of the subject matter.
Well, actually, when James gave us this title of the talk, 4,600 years, we didn't know how long this lecture is going to go on. But this is really amazing talent of James to keep a long story short. And now we are blessed with a lot of time for questions and answers. So I'm giving the cue.
Thank you, James. I have a critical comment and one question, Now, 4,600 years is one-fourth of this period covers Islamic civilization. So your topic is trade and cultural contacts. And I realize, your presentation, you did not touch on the Islamic civilization, because we know that Islamic civilization, by the end of the first century, Hijrah, what they call, or 6th century Gregorian calendar, changed the cultural shape of not India only, but from all the way from Philippines to Morocco and to Tatarstan in Russia, all the way to South Africa. So I was expecting that you will be touching on that subject matter of role of Islamic civilization in cultural contacts. This is my critical comment. The second thing, as a question, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned Persian Gulf. What is your take, or what is your thought or approach? Although we are in an academic institution, we are not in political environment. Do you consider it Persian Gulf or Arabian Gulf, which is ongoing discussion among the... Thank you.
Thanks. So on the question of the influence of Islam, so I focus mostly on, you can see I touched on some of the sort of the influence of Islam on South Asia. In this wider paper, which I didn't present here, I do talk about the significant impact of the Gulf on India. So if we look at Islam, Islam came to India from the Gulf in two ways. In Kerala, in the Malabar coast, it came from southern Arabia, right, from Yemen and Oman. And so because of the way the nature of the monsoons, sailors coming from Yemen and Oman to Kerala would have to stay until the next sailing season before they could return. So they had the sailors and seafarers developed a practice of taking temporary wives, right? And out of this practice, a whole community, India's oldest Muslim community, the Mappalas, developed. This was through trade and peaceful contact. And so the oldest mosque, which I also have in this paper, is in Kerala, founded in the 1st century of Islam. And the king of Kerala was the first Indian to go on pilgrimage, but he died en route, and his mausoleum is in Oman. I think he died on the way back. In the north, it's a different story. I showed you the maps. So we have in 711, we have the Arab conquest of Sind during the Umayyad Empire. And so Islam comes, through conquest in the north. Then what happens is Islam in the north came mostly through Iran and through these Persianate dynasties, the Delhi Sultanate, and then of course the Mughals, who, although Turkish, spoke Persian. Now, as a result, over time, North India became one of the main centers of Persianate culture, that is the Persian spoken by non-Persians as a lingua franca, for literary production and cultural output and so on. This is reflected in place names. I mean, if you take a look at the influence of Persian, which includes Arabic, of course, on place names in North India, it's massive. It's absolutely massive. However, because of the policies of the Modi government and Hindu nationalism, the Islamic history of India is now being erased and written out of the national narrative of India. But the impact of Islam on India is significant. So while I've been focusing mostly on India's cultural influence on the Gulf's impact, cultural influence on India has been equally, if not more, significant, as evidenced by the fact that the very name of India and the concept of the people of South Asia being Indians came from the Gulf. So it's truly significant. So it's really interesting. But because of modern nationalism, these cultural influences are sort of written out of the national narrative. With respect to the question of the name of the Gulf and the name game, actually I have a chapter in this on the book I'm working on right now, and I was very curious about this. Now, most of the literature and the debate has been focused on whose name is older. And of course, the region, like many bodies of water, has multiple names. And this has also received a lot of attention. But, you know, what I wanted to get to grips on, well, what did people here in the Emirates call the region, or in Bahrain call the region before the 1950s? And then how did the name game come about? Because the name was not contested before the 1950s. And so the answer is that historically, and in the region up until the 1960s and so on, you can even take a look at the letterhead for the government of Dubai or government of Bahrain, right? What term did they use? And the answer is Persian Gulf, because it's the historical name of the region. It's not the only one. The Ottomans called it the Gulf of Basra. And so I wanted to understand, where did Arab Gulf, Arabian Gulf come from? And the answer is that it came from Baghdad and Cairo. It was developed as part of the Arab nationalist movement in the 1930s and meant as a historical corrective to the fact that the name Persian Gulf was being used by Reza Shah and then later his son Mohammad Reza Shah as evidence to basically support their territorial claims over the islands and some parts of Eastern Arabia, right? And so Arab nationalists writing in newspapers in Baghdad and Cairo in the 1930s, and you can read these. These are on the Qatar Digital Library, which I was running until August. They are arguing, why are we calling this the Persian Gulf, right? Demographically, the Gulf region is Arab majority, right? So why are we calling it Persian? So they argued we should rename it, much like many other places rename themselves. Ceylon became Sri Lanka, and Burma became Myanmar, and so on. We should, adopt a new name that reflects the demographics on the ground, and also as a counter to the Tehran's territorial claims over the region. So they argued this in the newspapers, made this argument, but when Gamal Abdel Nasser came to power in the early 1950s, he didn't adopt this term. It was Abdul Karim Qasim who seized power in Baghdad in 1958, becoming president of Iraq. He passed a law saying, "Listen, it's Arabian Gulf, and it should be against the law to call it Persian Gulf." And so he passed a law that said this. So then this debate about the name of the Gulf then took place through the postal system. So what happened after that was that anyone in Baghdad or elsewhere in the Arab world who was beginning to use Arabian Gulf and putting it on their letters that were posted to Iran, the government in Tehran said, if you receive a letter that has it like that, return it to sender, right? And vice versa. So then all this mail coming from Iran that said Persian Gulf that was addressed here, people started returning to sender, right? So it began like that. Then the Gulf Airlines, when they began to be developed, like Kuwait Air and so on, they put, they had these in Tehran. They opened up their offices, right, and Iraq Air, and they had their glass fronts, right, and it said underneath Arabian Gulf. So then Iranians would go there and throw rocks through the windows, right? So this is all in the late 1950s. So this is when it began, and so the adoption of the term Arabian Gulf by the governments here in the Gulf itself happened slowly through the 60s and 70s. You can read accounts of it. It was a generational change. So the rulers, like, for example, Sheikh Rashid of Dubai, used the term Persian Gulf, right? But his children then adopted the new term because it was a generational term adopted by young Arab nationalists who were in their 20s in the 1950s. And so as they got older and moved up in the ranks in government, they began to require everybody to start using Arabian Gulf, right? So then by the 1970s, everybody's starting to use it, but some people continue to use Persian Gulf throughout the Arab world. So if you take a look at Arabic literature, like books published in Egypt or Jordan, or here, you'll still see Persian Gulf being used in book titles and so on, published by Arab authors in Arabic, right? But there was something that happened in 1980 that changed all of that, the Iran-Iraq War. After the Islamic Revolution in Tehran in 1979, that was basically an atomic bomb that went off in the Gulf region. It just set off a whole chain of events. One of which was, of course, the Iraqi invasion of Iran in 1980, and this basically resulted in, and then of course the GCC states supported Iraq. This resulted in an iron curtain coming down between the GCC states and Iran, right? And all the families that had deep connections with Iran and property there and so on, they had to choose, well, where are you going to hang your hat, there or here? And so it no longer became okay to go there. This is when it became tantamount to treason to use the term Persian Gulf if you were an Arab or living in the Arab world, right? Because now Iran was the enemy, right? It was before, it was a regional rival, but now it was the enemy. So it was and you can do Google Analytics, and you can look at book titles and article titles, newspapers and so on like that in Arabic, in all languages, but especially Arabic, and look at the frequency and the decreasing frequency of the term Arabian Gulf, Persian Gulf, and the increasing use of Arab and Arabian Gulf. And it sort of correlates with these political trends. But now, the term, people think it's an historical name for the region. And this is based on a misunderstanding. There are some maps of the Gulf that say Arabian Gulf on it, but these are mislabeled maps. The Red Sea was the Arabian Gulf. That's the historical name of the Red Sea. And then it later became the Red Sea. Sometimes it was also the Gulf of Aden was known as the Arabian Sea. The Arabian Gulf, which is right next to the Arabian Sea. So it makes sense, right? And so these mislabeled maps have been used as evidence to support the argument that the Arabian Gulf is an historical name for the Gulf here, which is not the case. So that's sort of the long answer to that.
Well, this is 6:06. I'm going to make an unfavorable announcement, and then we have to end the auditorium section of this talk. But the conversation can continue outside in the atrium over the reception. So I know there are many questions there in the crowd. And then so I want to thank Dr. James Onley again for his amazing lecture about this long connection between two important regions, India and then here, the Gulf. Thank you again. And then please join us in the reception. And then the conversation will continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.